Welcome everyone to the launch of our report, Building Solidarities, Gender Justice in a Time of Backlash. Welcome to those in the room and those of you who are online. Before I get on talking formally about different things, let me just do some housekeeping stuff. So if there is a fire alarm that is a real fire, please do run out. Live captions, those of you who are in Zoom, these are available, and the event is in English. We will be discussing serious stuff. So if at any point anybody feels uncomfortable, please do feel free to step outside. So that's a trigger warning, usual standard given these days. And the event is being recorded. So please, if you don't, and including the Q&A will be recorded. So please let us know if you don't want your image or what you're saying on social media. So we will keep those in mind. Having said that, this report is the product of a year-long process. We started last year, and here we are. It took us a long time and lots of discussions, and of course, it draws on many different sources, including IDS research, and we got a lot of help along the way from the reviewers and also our partners who gave us inputs. Having said that, let me tell you about the topic that we are covering and what it means. We all know that we are facing an anti-gender and anti-feminist backlash. We know that by 2030, we will be worse off in terms of gender equality. We know that we are not going to be meeting all the different indicators that's been outlined for SDG 5. We also know that between 2019 and 2022, 40% of the countries have rolled back different rights on gender equality, both women's rights and LGBTQI rights. So we are facing a big challenge. Having said that, this phenomena that we call anti-gender, anti-feminist backlash is not an isolated phenomena. We know that the world is facing a critical period in terms of rise of ethno-nationalism. We all know about the anti-migrant talks, anti-refugee talks. We know that there is a rise in misogyny and racist attacks, but on attacks also on activists who are trying to protect rights. But we also have seen attacks on democratic norms, both democratic institutions being weakened, protections being weakened. And on top of that, basically the usual way that you behave, both in public, but also online, the norms that you take for granted, those not being there. So in this time of crisis, there was and there is thinking around in the academia, but also in the policy world and among others who work on rights, thinking through how does this phenomena that we are talking about manifest, and it manifests differently in different contexts, and it is manifested by different actors. But it's also about not just understanding how it manifests, but it's also about then thinking through how do we counter this. And while we are starting with the story of doom and gloom, you will hear also stories of hope and stories of fighting back, because people do fight back, right? So at IDS itself, we have two programs. One is Countering Backlash, Reclaiming Gender Justice. The other one is Sustaining Power, Women's Struggles Against Contemporary Backlash in South Asia. And these research programs have been looking at the phenomenon of backlash, but also working with partners to understand what works in different contexts to fight back. The report itself covers issues from there, but the report also has IDS's rich history in gender and development. It draws on not only IDS's work and intellectual thinking, but it also draws on research that has been produced by the gender and development scholars and feminist scholars on these different issues. Obviously, we stand on shoulders of giants. IDS's teaching program, MA and Gender and Development program, the short course was introduced in 1984. And then the MA course, as you see it, came about in the mid-90s. And we have a rich history of not only teaching gender and development, but also alumni who have passed through IDS and who have done fantastic work around the world. So before we get on to discussing what's in the report, and my colleague Tessa Lewin, who is a fellow in Power, Inclusion, and Social Change Cluster, will be talking about that. But before that, we have a short video to showcase our alumni from around the world, and I hope you enjoy that.
Returning to Mexico after my studies, I noticed that women were significantly underrepresented in leadership roles.
I recently stood in this year's general election in the UK to be a member of parliament. Everywhere in the world, women and non-binary people are underrepresented in government.
Patriarchal society means that both boys as well as girls can suffer. In rural schools in Malawi, young boys lose out on vital education just because of the family pressure to work.
Funded and coordinated global gender backlash erodes the progress made in gender justice. These backlash actors often present the gains made in the rights of one community as a threat against the rights of another.
Like the majority of women across the world, I balance caring for a family with my career. Wherever women speak out or have a public profile, they suffer abuse. These barriers need to be broken down.
Collaborating with women leaders, we provided mentoring to young women said to be the first in their family to attend university. Through these programs, we supported many young women in starting their careers.
By meeting and connecting with these young people in this area, we are able to start building communities where these issues can be discussed.
Our work in Global South countries supports strengthening allyship and awareness across movements of sexually and gender diverse communities. Working together, we are challenging gender backlash narratives and anti-gender mobilization.
My pleasure to ask Tessa Lewin to take on the next bit of the program.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and those of you online. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our new report, Building Solidarities, Gender Justice in a Time of Backlash. This report reflects some of the work of the many of us currently working on gender and sexuality at IDS, and it builds on the work of many more. And this is not working. Sorry, Karen. Amazing, thanks. It takes as its starting point the recognition that discrimination on the basis of gender is deepening. Gender and sexuality are hugely effective social issues that are being widely strategically mobilized to connect to existing social anxieties. These mobilizations represent not just an attack on gender, but an attack on democracy, and they are part of a normative fight for how society is organized. We argue that the modest gender justice gains of queer and feminist movements have resulted in backlash because of the threat that they pose to the social structures that preserve existing privileges and entitlements. And our report outlines some of the ongoing work towards gender justice, and it situates it within the context of IDS's work on this over the last 50 years or so, and asks, given this context, what can we do? So some of the key areas of progress since the 70s that are highlighted in the report are the recognition that gender inequalities are interwoven with other inequalities, understanding how women's subordination operates through the care economy, a recognition of the need to move from individual empowerment to systemic change, a greater focus on sexual rights in development policy, and a greater emphasis on engaging men and boys in gender equality. However, in this time of backlash, we're seeing violence, harassment, and intimidation of gender justice activists, with many threatened or killed for their work. We're seeing anti-feminist and anti-LGBTQI narratives that stigmatize and exclude and often incite violence. We're seeing online attacks towards gender justice activists that are now commonplace. And we've seen a dramatic deterioration in the legal protections on the basis of gender and sexuality since 2022. And these attacks are led by disparate groups bound together by their opposition to gender rights. And they have received 3 times as much funding as LGBTQI movements. So what does it mean to build solidarities? It means that we explicitly recognize the unequal power structures within gender justice communities, that we identify pathways to unite across social movements, and that we learn to work with the diversity within feminist and queer movements, and that we show a commitment to ongoing self-reflection and uncomfortable conversations. And the report outlines 6 principles for building solidarities. These are amplifying diverse voices, embracing intersectional ways of working, decolonizing knowledge about gender and development, building resistance and solidarity through digital spaces, funding progressive action, and centering mutual care. Thank you. And now I would like to introduce Michaeli, who is joining us from AWID. She's the AWID co-executive director. And we really appreciate you being here so close to AWID. I know that you must have a lot on your plate. So thank you. Welcome.
Hello, good evening and good time of day. You know, I was looking, thank you for having me. I was looking at the name of the attendance and everything. That's actually a lot of new names, a few familiar names, hello there, but also some new names that I don't know, and it made me think how we work on such close topics, but sometimes have different audiences, and it would just be amazing, I think, to have more AWID members in these conversations, more of this audience. You're most welcome to join AWID as members, because I think building solidarities is, you know, it's not just in theory or somewhere out there, but I think also in our really close circles. So, so really grateful also for this invitation and for the opportunity to comment on the report. Congratulations. I think we all know that behind a few pages, there are many, many months of hard work, and sometimes short and concise is even more work than very long and exhausting. And I think the time for long and exhausting reports is over, unless we have very, very good reason for that. So I also want to appreciate the reader-friendly, the clarity, kind of the format of the report that I think could be, I could see it used by civil society as much as in the classroom, in academic context. So, and perhaps even in popular education as well. So really congratulations on that piece of work. I will just briefly introduce myself before and AWID's work, and then I would like to share perhaps just 3 out of the many things I appreciated about the report. So I'm Michaeli, one of AWID's 2 co-executive directors, and AWID's link to this work is historically, we have been doing the work on feminists resisting, it was really focused on feminists challenging fundamentalisms. And if you sort of, roll back about 15 years ago with a lot of work on there was post 9/11 and so on, with a lot of sort of anti-Muslim sentiment and racism and practices happening, and a lot of focus on Muslim fundamentalisms. And working in a feminist and cross-movement and cross-regional way, it was clear to us that those fundamentalist anti-right sort of like the earlier signs of some of the current attacks that we are seeing, they are across regions, they are across religions, and they are both secular and religious. And so that has led us to expand beyond fundamentalism to much broader anti-rights networks in our research, in our monitoring, in our advocacy. And indeed, the need to build solidarities, not just across regions and across languages, but also across movements. So feminist, gender justice, LGBTQI, trans-led, sex worker-led, but also on local, national, and global levels has been really, really key. And I think we can't exaggerate to what effect those of us organizing on local levels, on national and on regional and on global levels are not always as connected as we should be. So in that sense, I think the call to build solidarities and to unlearn some of the silos and some of the comfort zones are really, really key. And I think in that sense, the decolonial framework that you have put forth in the report is really key to be able to build those solidarities and to build those relationships in a way that is mindful of the power imbalances between those levels, also in terms of resources, in terms of access to resources, access to spaces, and access to different kinds of knowledge. And I think, just to say something in this time, because you have mentioned it's a difficult time. We are seeing a lot of harsh reality and injustice, and many of us feel helpless. We also live in a reality where sometimes for just saying the term genocide, you actually get more backlash than for actually committing genocide. And that says something very, very difficult about the times that we are in. We also, in terms of the resources, seeing the backlash, right? So the backlash, it's not only on social and cultural and political levels, but also economically, not just in terms of right-wing economic trends, but also the way that the ways of thinking and acting influence decisions about funding, about resources that are valuable for women's rights, for gender justice, for LGBTQI groups. So that's, and that's also, brings the question of solidarity, because when solidarity is easy, it's easy, but sometimes it's really needed when it is difficult and when you do pay the price. And I think this is when it's so important that those of us who work in institutions that may be academic, those who are active on grassroots level, those who are organizing or working within institutions, funding institutions, within civil society, within NGOs, we have to be able to find our allies and to build those solidarities and to work together. And also just being mindful that many of us hold more than one hat and we are more than one thing. So yeah, one thing I really appreciated is the colonial framework. As I said, I think it's really key, because until this very day, if you go to almost any advocacy space, you will see the same kind of the same attempt to use women's rights, gender justice as a capital, as a liberal capital, even by actors who are, when it comes to economy, when it comes to climate, function as anti-rights. So we need to be very clear that we do not allow women's rights to be used in the service of neocolonial agendas, right? The other aspect that I really appreciated about the report and that I think is really also forward-looking is the focus on the digital space and landscape and actors and tools as what is already so prominent in our lives in many ways, but is for sure growing every day also beyond our imagination. And so I think traditionally we have been looking at online attacks against activists and so on, but this goes so much deeper. It goes so much deeper. It goes also into ownership and capital that is behind those networks, to the extent to which the digital context is anti-democratic when it's owned by big tech, when it is not accountable in any way. And with artificial intelligence and, like even us with the AWID forum, we have been in really, and for those of you who don't know, it's an amazing global feminist movement convening that's coming up in just less than a couple of weeks in Thailand. We have been doing a crash course on how do you use artificial intelligence for interpretation, because suddenly you can have interpretation into 60 languages and you have that accessibility. But then how do you weigh that against other considerations of data privacy, of language justice, of labor rights when it comes to our community of translators and interpreters? So really seeing how that is very, very present, especially around issues of data privacy, really. So very much appreciating the focus on that, and I think all of us will be having many more conversations, and quite intense learning around that as well. And the third aspect that I also very much appreciated about the report is the focus on resourcing, because we have to be able to speak about that. And I think one of the beautiful things that I'm seeing, that we are seeing in feminist organizing, is that we want to go beyond just claiming the resources, even if those resources that we need and deserve, but we also want to have a say in how those resources are generated, in how wealth is generated, and in who makes the decisions, in how power operates in decisions about funding priorities, about flows, but also in the context of economic justice more broadly, because we know that economic justice and gender justice are such interrelated issues. And the economy is a feminist issue, very feminist issue. Perhaps I think one thing that is really important about resourcing is that we have to have those conversations on two levels. I think one, and they're also very much interrelated. One is how do we unpack the current trends? How do we heal the very traumatic experiences that so many of our movements and organizations have had with funding and with funders? How do we strengthen our relationships with our allies in the funding world? And how do we have strategic conversations about what are resources, right? Because we know also that movements are their own most important resource. At the same time, the other level in which we have to have those conversations are the fact that now, with the withdrawal of funding that we are seeing, both from bilateral, from multilateral institutions, but also from private philanthropy as well, for many feminist and LGBTQI groups and organizations, this is about survival. This is really about the survival of those groups. And so there's also the more urgent questions of how do we find resources outside of the box. And if gender portfolios are either disappearing or being emptied out, then how do we make sure that feminists who are on the front lines of climate justice struggles, of crisis in war regions, and who are also on the fronts of struggles for democracy, are able to access those resources, the resources that go to humanitarian work, to climate justice, to all those areas, but they are not reaching the feminists that are leading those fights. So, and I think just being able to put all those and several others, but my time is limited, and several other aspects together in a more sort of holistic and comprehensive and yet concise framework is really, I think, one of the strengths of the report that you were able to produce for all of us. So yeah, I think I'll pause here and just say thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to share those comments with you.
Thanks very much, Ina. And I believe I'm introducing Vivek next, although hi.
Vivek.
Yes, you are here. Hi, Vivek Rai, Deputy Director of the Civil Society Division of UN Women, who is also going to reflect and respond to the report. Welcome, Vivek. Thank you.
Thank you, Tessa. Thank you, Sohaila, for your openings, and thank you, Ina, for your perspective. Ina, you're always a very hard act to follow, but I'll try and do my best. So as Tessa pointed out, my name is Vivek Rai, and I work in the Civil Society Division at UN Women. I'm based out of New York. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. On behalf of UN Women, I'm honored to congratulate IDS on the launch of this report. It really provides such a timely and such an insightful analysis of the challenges that we're facing in the gender equality space and the democracy space, building off also what Ina was just saying, while also underlaying the ways forward that we can navigate together. So I think, you know, as some of my reflections on the report, as you point out, some of this pushback that we are talking about is not new. But what I think is really emerging strongly from the report is the fact that the increased strength of it, and especially this rise of the nexus of both state and non-state actors coming together, as well as a huge amount of money that is being poured into it, that we really need to be paying attention to. This backlash, you know, is extending beyond policy rollbacks to violence, harassment, and the curtailment of legal protections. You know, these challenges have been compounded by disinformation in the digital sphere, and so that the focus on the digital sphere that you provide is integral. The shrinking of civic space that we are seeing, and the fact that it's cutting across both the global north and the south. I think I also wanted to say, you know, that speaking from the perspective of a multilateral institution, and also building off something that Sohaila said in her opening around the intersection of democracy and gender equality, I think it's also important to highlight that this pushback that we are seeing is also interconnected with the weakening of the multilateral institutions, including the UN, that is very much part of this pushback agenda. And I think it's important to recognize that political strategy as well, while of course not moving away from some of the inherent challenges of the UN and multilateral institutions, but nevertheless recognizing that this pushback that we are seeing is also indicative of the weakening of multilateral institutions that we are seeing across the board. And so therefore, as the report points out, the need for strengthened solidarities is even greater at this point of the work that we are doing. And as the report underscores, history shows us that resistance to these forces is possible when diverse actors unite with resilience, with solidarity and innovation. And so in that sense, UN Women recognizes and appreciates this report's emphasis on intersectional approaches, on the decolonization of knowledge and the amplifying of underrepresented voices. And this is also central to our evolving strategy that we are working on called Push Forward for Rights, Equality and Justice, which some of you might be familiar with as we start to socialize it among our partners, including some of the work that we've done with IDS. I would also like to highlight at this point the report that we are doing on defending rights in hostile times, understanding backlash to advance gender equality, that my colleagues in the research and data section are doing. I see Constanza Tabushkani online, and this is something that she's been working with, and to highlight how these intersect with the work that IDS has just put out. So a little bit about the push forward strategy and which is very much part of the work that we're doing around the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action, which, as you know, is coming in 2025. And so this push forward strategy is focusing on building multi-stakeholder alliances, supporting women human rights defenders, and countering pushback with evidence-based practices and inclusive dialogue. And as I've pointed out, there are a number of areas from the IDS report that we have commonality with, which we would like to jointly achieve. For example, both the report and our strategy prioritize amplifying diverse voices, particularly those from marginalized communities, and promoting intersectional, intergenerational solidarity across sectors. The part on recognizing disability, age, and life cycle constraints is critical to strengthening our movements. And in that same vein, equally critical is the voice and amplifying diverse voices. As I said, the point that Ina raised about expanding the diversity of languages that we need to be communicating through is essential. Also in line with the principles of decolonization that the report talks about, while recognizing, of course, the complexities around this that Ina has also just flagged in her opening remarks. And another thing that when we talk about visual approaches as becoming increasingly important in feminist activism, I think it's also important to highlight the need to engage in popular culture mediums. These mediums are evolving and have evolved. I'd like to offer maybe an older example. I come from India, and I grew up in the 1980s. We had on what was at that time state television, a TV serial called Hum Log, which is a very popular TV serial that helped shape the ideas around family planning. It picked up ideas from the Mexican telenovelas, the work that the Population Communications International did in terms of the Sabido methodology that some of you might be familiar with, which helped shape social narratives. And so therefore, that example, recognizing that there are many more mediums now, but how do we use popular culture to advance some of this pushback to the pushback is critical. In that same vein, the focus of the report has made on leveraging digital spaces, as Dina pointed out, as sites of resistance, also aligns with the push forward strategies, advocacy for safe and inclusive space, for eco and feminist activism. We echo the call for a feminist funding ecosystem that directly supports transformative community level initiatives, and also recognize that larger international institutions, including ours, need to think more carefully and respectfully on how to navigate the space of a very finite and mostly under-resourced space that Ina has also talked about. And then in line with the report's emphasis on mutual care, our work on Push Forward also remains dedicated to supporting the well-being of activists and fostering environments of solidarity and healing. UN Women is also committed to recognizing the role of men and boys in advancing the gender equality agenda, while being very cognizant of that accountability in that space that needs to go hand in hand with that approach. And we are also very, very grateful to both current and past members of IDS, including Yeka, including Andrea Cornwall, Alan Gregg, and others who have been such a strong partner to us on this. The guiding principles outlined in the report provide a critical roadmap for action. We are committed to incorporating these principles into our strategies, especially the work that we are also doing on civic space internally. UN Women, along with OHCHR, is internally leading a task force on expanding civic space within the UN system, and many things that emerge from the report actually are good pointers in terms of how we can advance that work. So again, thank you very much for that. I'm mindful of time. This report calls for a centering of solidarities for gender equality and provides clear-cut ways of doing so. We aim to learn from it and will continue to convene stakeholders, amplify impactful practices, and advocate for policies that resist regression and stagnation, and also ensure progress in partnership with you. And so we thank IDS, and we are very grateful to have been included in this conversation. And we look forward to also continuing the conversation at AWID for those of you who will be there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vivek. I'm going to hand over to Susie, who is going to chair the panel discussion. Sorry,
Susie.
Susie, should I?
Or you should introduce yourself. I forgot to introduce myself.
I'm Susie Jolly, and I'm an honorary associate with IDS. And for several years ago, I worked at IDS and founded the IDS Sexuality and Development Program when that was still a new thing, and the links between sexuality and macro politics were less obvious for unfortunately not, they become more obvious in the bad ways as well as the good ways. But anyway, here we are now, and I want to first thank Vivek for your reflections and also sharing your strategies for pushing forward. And I'd like to introduce our wonderful panel of, we have 4 women who bring together a huge amount of experience and wisdom. We have Maheen Sultan, who's Senior Fellow at BRAC Institute of Governance and Development in Bangladesh. We have Melanie Judge, Professor of Public Law at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Nana Sauris from Sexuality Policy Watch in Brazil, also an IDS Gender MA alumni. And from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, we have Benedetta Musillo, who's in Ethiopia, and she's traveling right now. So the connection is good now, but if we have a problem with connection, her colleague Francis Godfrey in London will take over. So thank you all. How it's going to work, I'm going to ask a couple of questions to each of our panelists that will, and I'm hoping you can give me really short 3-minute answers. And then we'll move on to questions from the people in the room and the people online. So if you're online, you can put questions in the Q&A, not in the chat box, but in the Q&A, and you can do that at any time. So thank you. I'm going to start with a question, the same question for all of you, which is this wonderful report talks about solidarity, building solidarities to create a stronger, more together movement to better counter the backlash. What solidarities can be built or are being built in your regions and in your thematics to help counter the backlash? Why don't we start with Melanie?
Thanks, Susie, and thanks, everyone. I trust you can hear me all the way from South Africa. It's good to be in the room, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to engage with what I think is a very important and timely and insightful report. Very briefly, I know I've got 3 minutes. I promise to stick to it. I think as the report suggests, we know that one of the most concentrated points of recent backlash, at least in the Africa region where I'm located and work, is around anti-LGBTQ lawmaking. And I think, as others have said, we are seeing how that becomes a point of convergence for Western anti-gender actors who are mobilizing and working with local conservative religious leaders and with opportunistic politicians to expand the criminalization of sexual and gender diversity through a real instrumentalization of law. And we've seen this in Ghana, in Kenya, in Uganda as cases in point. These efforts to expand criminalization now, as we know, extend to allies, which includes those who fund, advocate for, or seek to protect the rights of LGBTQI communities. This seminar would be a criminal act if I was a Ugandan, and also with wide global jurisdiction. So that's how far the reach is in terms of extending criminalization. And I think what I want to underscore here is that this kind of lawmaking, amongst other aims, intends to break existing solidarities by increasing the social and criminal risks associated with supporting queer struggles. And so I think it's even more pressing now to strengthen cross-sector and cross-movement alliances in the face of multiple pushbacks that are fueling social tensions, restricting civic expression, and ultimately fortifying the exercise of unchecked power by the state and its lawmakers. And I think many activists in the African context are organizing in response to governance failures, in response to state repressions, and are entering through solidarities around different points of conversion around these pushback issues. I think also in these climates, activists are thinking beyond comfortable allyships towards what I want to refer to as perhaps more radical forms of solidarity that the report is signaling us to. And by radical solidarity, I mean sustained and ethical positions and actions that ultimately aim to radically transform social and political fields. If we see radical solidarity as a practice, I think it also requires building common ground across sites of intersecting marginalization. And I think this task of building common ground through solidarity is very important at a time when oppositional forces are actively seeking to diminish common ground. And I think it moves us beyond the rights and interests of a particular movement or sector and into a much wider circuit of actors with whom we must seek more just and equitable forms of coexistence. I'm not convinced, though, that radical solidarity can be built on a politics of purity or by reaching overdetermined agreements on absolutely everything across our movements. I do think that it's rooted in fundamental principles and ethical practices that in some ways distinguish those who are in solidarity and the visions they have for the world from those who seek to annihilate those very principles and that very vision. And I think there are many activists in the context in which I'm working that are trying to build alternative visions of futures, of queer futures, of African futures. And I think those kinds of visions of futures are in effect what there's an attempt to annihilate. I think necessarily this work of radical solidarity, as others have also suggested, is happening both inside and outside of our social movements. And I don't think it should be confused with political uniformity or homogeneity, but rather as standing visibly with and for marginalized others, not despite the differences and the inequalities amongst us, but I think precisely because of those. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Benedetta, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you so much. So yes, very pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me here. So to go straight to, and congratulations on this great report that I think is very timely and quite provocative in so many ways in its simplicity and its briefness. So in FCDO, we like to think about the way we, promote solidarities through three main channels and a fourth one, which is a little bit more challenging for us. So the first one is about intersectional solidarity. So we really recognize the importance of working intersectionally to build solidarities within and across feminist movement. But we know, as has been said by previous speakers, that we have to stop working in silos. We need to really foster the cross work that we have to do across movements and entity and context to be able to fight and counteract this very strong movement that is growing and is much better organized than we may want to think. At the moment, we're funding more than 1,000 feminist movement globally through the Equality Fund and the Women of the South Speak Out program in South Africa. We use this fund, core funding, to support them grow, to improve their advocacy, to help them connect, network, and have a stronger grassroots impact. And we also support many other country-based initiatives that strengthen inclusion, civil society, LGBT rights, at national level and at regional level. However, we tend to work mostly with feminist movement, and also within the feminist movement, we understand not everybody's included. So we need to really learn and build and challenge ourselves to ensure that nobody's left behind. And we also include the voice of young people or women with disability, non-binary people, and other marginalized people, which is not always easy. And sometimes this can be quite complex. The second way we build the solidarities is through the digital space. So we know that solidarity, the digital space can be a fantastic place for movements, for civil society, for right organization to establish network, to learn, to share experience, to build consensus, and to learn from each other. But the digital space is not always safe. And so the UK government, through the AI Safety Summit in 2003, then with the approval of the Online Safety Act in 2023 to reduce online harm, and by joining the Global Partnership to End Online Harassment and Abuse, we're trying really actively to promote certain principles like safety by design and including AI development and capacity building to make sure that the digital space remains safe and can be really empowered. The third one is about looking at building solidarity through transnational action. We use all of our diplomatic and development levers to advocate for gender justice in international agreement and multilateral spaces. As you know, we sit in the Human Rights Council, at the UN Security Council, in G7, and so many other places where we really try to promote, push, and ensure that the language remains safe and protected and global standards and norms remain strong. And we also make an effort to ensure that WROs get a seat at the table and get their voice expressed and represented. At work, at Post, we've got lots of network that tracks and respond to cases of backlash, prioritizing engagement with local actors, getting their advice on how best to engage and make sure that we don't undermine their safety. The last one is the one where it's a bit more challenging for us, which is the care and healing solidarity. Honestly, this is a bit more difficult for us as we are a northern donor with a colonial history, so it's really hard for us, and we don't think it should be from us to promote, to define how to build this care and healing solidarity. What we can do, what we do is to promote principle, as my previous speaker was saying. So ensuring that search methods that are, that are sensitive to the rights and to the knowledge, the rights, the voices of the global majority. So we feel that the care and healing itself has to come from the people involved directly in this work. And we welcome your views on how best we can support you. And I stop here for the moment.
Thank you so much. Let's have Nana next.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So hi everyone, I'm Nana, I'm based in Brazil. And first I would like to thank the invitation. As a former IDS student, I have to say that I'm super honored to be with you, and that 5 years ago, Susie Jolly was the first person to ever introduce me to Sexuality Policy Watch, and that's where I work now. So thanks for that, Susie. And I would also like to congratulate everyone on IDS for this report, particularly for the emphasis on building solidarities. So answering the question, in Brazil, as in other countries, we have been witnessing anti-gender backlash focusing on trans people, on their rights and their citizenship. And speaking from feminist movements, I think it took some time for this problem to be framed as not only an LGBT issue. And in fact, I think this is still happening. But it has become more and more clear that anti-trans offensives are attacks on all of us, and that attacks on gender are attacks on everyone who challenges or questions gender norms. So for instance, policing bathrooms or women's sports affects all women, all people in their dignity. So we have been seeing initiatives centering feminist initiatives centering trans or gender diverse people, or at the very least, adapting the communications to use inclusive language, for instance. And I don't want to romanticize my context by saying that we have it all settled with no conflicts and that we have all understood the message, because believe me, that's not the case. The conflicts have never been as intense as they are now, and we are just finishing a report about that. But I do think that this new wave of violent attacks towards gender, if it can teach us anything, is that we have to unite, because creating division is precisely our opponent's strategy, because it clearly weakens our movements and destroys them from within. So in short, I think it's about time for us as feminist movements to understand that trans rights are a feminist issue, and to build not only solidarity, but effective alliances and partnerships with trans movements, with LGBT movements, and so on. And I think we need to be open to new alliances, to embrace new causes, as well as to accept that we must be allies, the allies that we have so desperately wanted for years in our own movements. In Brazil, trans movements have fought and still fight with us for menstrual dignity, for laws tackling domestic violence, and for the right to safe and legal abortion. So why shouldn't we be together and by their side when the right to self-determination is at stake? Wasn't this at the core of feminist principles from the beginning? So lastly, I think it's important to say, this is very important to me, that in the ideal world, it wouldn't take such violent attacks for us to unite, right? But if this is what it is, so be it. Better late than never. And even the worst crises, they can provide opportunities for action, and we cannot let this one escape from us because we have a long way forward. So I'm stopping here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm hearing from more than one of you. We've got to resist efforts to divide us, and that's an important and encouraging message. Now, Maheen, over to you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for bringing out this very interesting report. And I think it's very useful, timely, and thought-provoking, especially on, what needs to be done to build solidarity. So in Bangladesh, as in Asia, as in most of the world, we are facing rising backlash, which is affecting organizing, mobilizing, and being able to express ourselves, even basic freedoms. So all kinds of intimidation, everything that people have talked about shrinking civic space, rise of various different kinds of forces, militant majoritarianism, which is really affecting us. But talking about building solidarities, the research we have been doing on the sustaining power for women's rights, we have found that one of the strategies that has worked and that is working for the various movements is that of working through coalitions, building coalitions. And, we found this has increased their visibility, their legitimacy. It allows bringing in different kinds of resources, different kinds of skills, experiences to make the movement stronger. And it also helps to withstand the various kinds of pressure and the backlash that these different movements face when they can provide a united front. There are obviously various challenges, which also the report has briefly talked about, that, how do you build consensus around your demands? How do you bring in diverse groups around a common platform? How do you manage, let's say, intergenerational presence, representation? How do you bring in intersectional representation? These are all challenges that the various coalitions we studied had to face with, had to deal with, had to face. And there are also challenges in, how you sustain, how you provide leadership to a coalition to take forward the demands, and how to face the different kinds of backlash that are there. Some of the attempts we've seen to create solidarity is like, for example, the women's movement trying to come together with the labor movement. For example, in Bangladesh, we have such a large number of women in the RMG sector, and often these different struggles, the labor struggles, have been divorced from the women's rights struggles. How to bring those together, how to bring the sex workers movement closer to the women's workers' rights movement, to be recognized as workers, sex work as work. Also the attempts to bring in the LGBTQI movement closer to the women's movement, to recognize these as feminist struggles. And all these, it's not without tensions, but these are, solidarities, we can say, in the making. There's also the issue of religious minorities, and how in the, let's say, the Muslim minority in India and the Hindu minority in Bangladesh, that often these minority struggles are not seen as part of the mainstream struggles. So how to bring those in to be seen as also part of the women's rights struggles. So, there's this emphasis on how to look at the common goals and common interests going beyond the more smaller or, the day-to-day differences in these different movements. And also looking at the importance of solidarities that go beyond borders. This was also mentioned by other speakers. And I think in some areas this has worked much better than in others. For example, in the whole area of sexual and reproductive health rights, where it's really the international solidarities have given strength to what's happening on the ground. But this hasn't happened in all areas. So this is something we need to further work on.
Thank you so much for those very real stories of solidarities in the making. I'm now going to ask one more question to each of you, and it will be a different question for each. So I'm going to start with a big question for Nana. Sexuality Policy Watch does amazing analysis of the macro politics of sexuality, including a compilation on the US elections. We're all grieving at the results, though we won't be destroyed by it. How do you process this? How do we understand this and go forward? And what does it look like from Brazil?
Okay, easy question. Let's start with the easy question. So first, I think it's important to say as well that we are preparing a special on the US election. So we will have something published that will go deeper. But what I can say that speaking from an organization that has been closely following the steps of anti-gender forces globally, the results of the US cannot be seen entirely as a surprise, right? Although they are for sure devastating. It's a big win for the global anti-gender movement due to the geopolitical and financial power of the US. But I'm speaking from Brazil, but I think Trump's victory must be analyzed through a transnational lens because it is part of a phenomenon that transcends the US, right? Because the far right has been reorganizing for decades and globally. And in this reorganization or reconfiguration of strategies, gender is a central component, but not the only one. And this is very important because we cannot lose sight of other issues such as race, migration, the environment, national security. But the framework that we use at Sexuality Policy Watch is that gender acts as an umbrella term or as a symbolic glue that allows a wide range of actors who have internal differences, several differences, to work together in an anti-gender, to work as anti-gender forces. And I think we can see the centrality of gender in everything that involves abortion rights, since before the overturn of Roe versus Wade. We cannot forget that it was in Trump's first administration that the conservative judges were nominated that were crucial for the overturn. But also very important is this has to do with Brazil as well. It was also during Trump's first administration that the Geneva Consensus was created, mainly focusing on fighting abortion rights around the globe. Brazil was part of that at the time, but we are not anymore. But it's expected that under Trump, the US will rejoin the group because it's also, and the US rejoining can significantly change its importance in the global arena again. But also I think we cannot talk about this election without talking about Project 2025, which is a document by the Heritage Foundation, which is a right-wing think tank. And this document is a sort of a guide to a Republican presidency. And it's 100% anti-gender, 100% anti-abortion, anti-LGBT, migration, it denies climate change, and etc. And I think it's, in fact, a really good example of why we don't frame this reorganization as exactly as being only backlash, because it's clear that the far-right forces have a long-term project, and they are producing realities as well, not only responding to some feminist advances, but to end on a positive note. I think I want to reinforce one idea, that Trump's victory, the potential threat to human rights that it poses, and precisely the comprehensive scope of these ultra-conservative policies, being gender, race, and everything. These are also great reasons for us to build cross-movement solidarities, right? That's the opportunity, because it is going to affect us all. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you so much for that acute analysis and for ending on a positive note. We need to encourage each other. Okay, Maheen, I know there's still many challenges and struggles in Bangladesh, but the government has moved in the right direction. The Student People's Uprising led to the Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina fleeing the country a few months ago, and it's now being led by Muhammad Yunus, who Nobel Peace Prize winner and founder of the Grameen Bank. And are you, I'm not sure if you're involved in some women's advisory on the Women's Commission. Please tell us more, and please tell us how this shift in government, what it means for countering the backlash and promoting gender justice in Bangladesh and the region.
So you're right, it is a very positive development, and we were all very encouraged because for a long time it seemed that nothing would change and we were stuck in a very depressing situation. So the movement that happened was a relatively rapid movement over the period of 3 months. Everything turned upside down. It was a youth-led movement which the larger population joined. There was a very large number of women who were involved, young women, which was also very positive, very inspiring. And it wasn't only in the capital, it really spread all over the country. And workers joined in as well, and parents and young people. So it was very inspiring. And we had women on the streets breaking all sorts of stereotypes, being out all night, physically fighting with the police, even veiled women coming out, joining ranks with young men and other young women. So this was very encouraging. And their main slogan was that the movement was anti-discrimination. And they have been saying that they want to be inclusive, they want to change the structures, fascist structures or more authoritarian structures to bring about democracy, citizens' participation. Various advisory committees have been created, reform commissions. I'm a member of the Women's Affairs Reforms Commission. So as usual, they've delegated women to one commission, but we're trying to influence all the other commissions. But I think we're in a very critical situation in a way, a situation of flux, situation of transition. And what we're finding out that, the state is only one actor, only one kind of backlash actor, that removing a sort of totalitarian state structure has allowed other voices and other forces to become more vocal and more visible and out in the open. So now we're having to put up a fight, put up a struggle just to retain the gains we have made, and also to make use of this opportunity where we are talking about reforming the constitution, bringing in governance, accountability, changes to those structures, to bring in systemic changes to the way the country is run. So it's a huge opportunity, but at the same time, we are facing various kinds of threats that we shouldn't be forced backwards to losing the gains we have made in the past. So it's a very critical period, and where we all have to mobilize and be both on the streets as well as at the table. And we need all the support we can get from everybody, both in the country and outside the country. And I think this is also a moment where the different rights-based movements have to come together and use this opportunity to move forward as well as preserve the gains we have made in the past.
Thank you so much for sharing those realities and as well as some of the hopes. And now, Melanie, going back to the report calls for decolonizing gender and development knowledge as part of what's needed to challenge the hierarchies within the women's movement, the feminist movement, and enable greater solidarity to better tackle the backlash. Can you talk to decolonizing and how it can help us counter the backlash?
Thanks, Susie. I mean, just to build on Nana's point around Project 2025, because I think that's a good example of kind of a recolonization of knowledge about gender and development that's going to have massive implications way beyond the boundaries of the United States. And so that's part of what we're up again, this sort of vision of, as you were saying, it's about a future as much as it's about a kind of a fictional past. And I think I'm raising this as an entry point into this idea that gender backlash, as we all know, and many of the people at IDS have written about, that gender backlash is also very much happening at the level of meaning making, which of course directly impacts the material world. So not in a conceptual sense, but making meaning. And we see these battles of meaning around what sex, sexuality, and gender are, with all the bogus science that supports that, and what they should be, and about their relationship to bodies, actual bodies, and then to the body politic. And there are reactionary meanings that are being produced and reproduced that are really about wanting to discipline and control sexual and gendered life in general, as Nana was saying, not just the queers or the feminists, absolutely in the most general of senses. And I think in these struggles over meanings, I would argue that expressions of sexual and gender diversity that were previously erased by colonization have emerged as very critical sites of knowledge. You've seen much more visibility and vocality, at least in the context in which I'm working, from women and LGBTIQ people on sexual violence, on issues of harassment and intimidation. I know that the report gave the Me Too movement a bad rap, and maybe that comment is for a later discussion, but I think it definitely opened up possibilities for the kind of cultural work around the knowledges of people who are subjected to violence and discrimination, not only in the global north. And I think, of course, although the terms for these expressions of sexual and gender diversity and identity are always imperfect, I think sometimes they're inherited from another time and place. I think the work that activists are doing of giving them meaning and context is precisely part of what's being struggled for. The work on narrative change as a strategy against backlash, which is also obviously about mobilizing the power of meaning, I think is an important site of struggle. And one activist organization in Kenya, for example, has been challenging what's been done to LGBTIQ people in the name of promoting and protecting family values. And so they seek to really show how it is in fact family violence that's been protected and promoted through anti-LGBTQ laws. So this shifting the narrative from values, ostensible values, to violence also exposes the colonial continuities in how African families and sexualities continue to be governed through violent means. And so I think that LGBTQ movements in the African context are at the forefront of this decolonizing work, which is also about challenging very deep-seated colonial myths that African identities are exclusively and uncontestably heterosexual and gender binaried. And I think even though it makes right-wingers very anxious, this ever-expanding smorgasbord of sexual and gender identities is the most powerful way to speak back to these binaries. All those letters of the alphabet that, you know, our ruling elite will never be able to put back in the box. And then finally, on this issue of hierarchies in movements, and be those hierarchies, you know, be they about race, about class, about gender, about location, to name a few, they are, of course, alive and well within our own social movements, as others have alluded to. And I think one feature of this aliveness of these hierarchies is precisely in how some knowledges and the assumptions that they assert are very preciously guarded at the expense of others. Knowledge is about sex, sexuality, sexual and gender identities. And I think that those knowledges actually protect the power that's offered to some, again, at the expense of others. So the work of untangling how the terms we use and the concepts we use are forms of knowledges that can be inclusionary or violent and exclusionary, I think is important. And while we engage with this kind of diversified ways of knowing, which I think is a critical contribution that the report makes, I think hopefully more opportunities will open to reckon with these dynamics of inequality in our spaces, and maybe also to strengthen this notion of common.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Okay, so the last question from me is for Benedetta. And can you tell us about the role of research in countering the backlash, how FPDO approaches this topic, and what you think the research gaps are?
Okay, so at most basic, research is critical to help us better understand the nature and extent of the backlash, because it's only when we understand it better that we can shape and inform action to counteract it most effectively and use the little resources to really operate it nicely. At high level, our FFCD central question is what works to counter the backlash and promote gender justice in a cost-effective and decolonial way at multilateral, regional, and national level. We need to know more about different thematic areas because we believe that politics, religion, climate change, economic trends, technology facilitated, gender-based violence are all linked to the backlash. So how they interact, who is behind that. So the actors are also very important. Who is behind that? How they operate? What are the tactics? What are the strategy? What are the funding mechanisms? We need to understand those because I think that, as I said it before, I think they're ahead of us, and maybe we can learn something about how they operate that we could use in the, in the pro-rights movement. To do this, we need to build wide alliances. I think Ali was saying that, Ella was saying at the beginning, we need to align ourselves with tech actors, with the private sector, with government, with journalists, with lawyers, and also engage more with men and religious leaders. This is a challenging one. It's not easy to know who and how to do this, but we need to expand our network to be able to build a stronger coalition. And it needs very careful navigation. And I would love to hear more what the research brings us and what example we've got. I'm very grateful for a lot of pioneers and IDS that has been working on this for a long, long time. And so I've got 3 challenging research questions that we're scratching our heads on. And online there is Francis that has been reading a lot of evidence, and we work quite closely with you, but still, we don't know the answer. So I ask you all, academic out there and practitioner, help us. So first one is related to finance. So we know the WRO currently receive about less than a percentage of ODA, and funding are reducing. The Dutch, the Swedish, Wellspring now, they're all ending their funding to WROs. And we've got, the USA new government that is predicted to reduce, funding in this space, if not anything worse. So the UK government is doing a lot to encourage other funders to put more money, and we're trying to test new methods for us to support WROs by providing co-funding through the Equality Fund, but it's a hard thing to sell. We are a big organization with a demand for accountability on how we spend taxpayer money. So giving money without that kind of accountability and transparency is really hard. So we need more evidence to demonstrate that there is impact and it's cost effective to give money to this WRO. So that is a critical piece of evidence that we don't have. So how can we do that? The second one is about decolonizing research. So that's a difficult one. Again, I love in the report that a lot of qualitative methods that are proposed to improve and to expand the voice of people, express their realities and make them heard, and retake, retake this agenda, nationalize this agenda in the best way. I'm all pro qualitative research, but we need to make sure that this research is rigorous. So again, how can you help this research to have solid base and be acknowledged and recognized as a very strong source of evidence? At the same time, as a background, I'm an economist, and I've noticed in the past how in the HIV/AIDS and also the women's economic empowerment, the moment where we really were able to shift the needle is when we were bringing very hardcore quantitative data to demonstrate the extent, the cost, and to the economy, to society of not dealing with those challenges. So I think we need to be creative and find quantitative way to assess, analyze, respond to this challenge, to be able to tap in the minds of Minister of Finance and governments that still think that quantitative is what they need. The third one is about how how we can engage others. How do we bring religious leaders next to feminist movement or LGBTQ movements? How do we do that? It's challenging, but I think we need to do. And how we do this, and how do we get more organized, get more evidence without providing fuel for fire for anti-rights actors and opening up them more opportunities to target WROs. Thank you so much.
Thank you for those very concrete answers. That's incredibly helpful. I'd now like to open to the floor. We'll take a few questions together, if there are them, from people in the room, and then we'll move on to the online questions. So this is your chance. Any questions? Okay, why don't you start? Yeah.
Marvelous, thank you very much. Congratulations. Yep, hello everyone. I'm Barbara Crossworth. I'm the co-director of the Centre for International Education, also here at Sussex. Thank you first for a wonderful report. Congratulations to all that were involved. And thank you to the panelists as well. I would just like to question the response from our final panelist there on the request for more quantitative data. And I work on gender myself and education, and focusing now very much on the intersections of gender, education and work in different contexts of Africa mainly. But there seems to me to be a wealth of quantitative data that actually says women are still not getting into positions of power. There are still big gender gaps in terms of pay. Gender violence stats are huge. It seems that there is already a lot of quantitative data, and what we need, for me, therefore, is to contextualize that in the ways that this report has beautifully done. So it's just, it's quite a direct response to our final panelist there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, go ahead, BC. Should we take these 4 and then we stop?
So, hi, I am an MA Gender Violence and Conflict student here in Sussex. I have a question that personally bugs me when we talk about building alliance and coalitions within the feminist movement, but also outside. And that is, how do we deal with the fact that a lot of the feminists are trans exclusionary? And how do we try and build common ground, knowing that there is a very big value, a core value that we disagree, while we are both trying to advocate for the same things within against the broader anti-gender backlash. And I mean, thanks for the work and everything that goes without saying, but yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ben. I work here at IDS. My question, I guess, builds a little bit on your question around the burden in solidarities and where the burden lies, and how solidarities can be equitable, particularly whether it's with trans folks, how they don't have to take on the full burden of the work. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, I'm Chandni. I'm an MA gender student at IDS. This is a really great report, and it was so great to have so many of my lecturers contribute to it and be so close to this work and see that come to life. My question relates to the decolonizing knowledge aspect of the report. And what I see so commonly now is decoloniality is co-opted and boxed in order to be made presentable in reports that very much further the neoliberal agenda. And like when we have reports that don't mention the genocide in Palestine, that don't mention the continued dehumanization of Arab women, that don't speak to caste as openly as we know from super findings at IDS itself. How do we really push that agenda on decolonizing knowledge without it just becoming another buzzword, which we love at IDS?
Thank you. So you don't all have to answer all the questions. If you want, you can pick one or two of the questions to respond to. There's the questions about, do we already have enough quantitative data on challenges women face? What about how do we deal with trans exclusionary feminism, and where does the burden of solidarity lie? And what about the co-option of decoloniality to further neoliberal agendas? So who would like to step in?
Let me take the one addressed to me, please, Susie. Yeah, I don't disagree at all with the speaker. I know we've got a lot of, quantitative data. I don't think in these specific rights movements we've got data, quantitative data. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm really happy to be, to be informed about that one. But there have been changes. And I work a lot on gender-based violence, and we now finally have been able to demonstrate that violence prevention is possible, can be cut by 50% in 2-3 years when implementation is designed properly, engage communities, couples, and all norms in that community. But not policymaker is taking it up. Nobody's know how to scale it up. Nobody know how to do it properly, and whether the power of that effect is going to expand. But in women's economic empowerment, we also had some wins. We now have, Ministry of Finance implemented gender budgeting. We've got the IMF that has published the first gender strategies, thanks to the research we did behind it and trying to demonstrate with the case that if you do not bring women into the economy, the economy is going to win, and there's a huge loss of talents. So I wouldn't give it completely all away. I'm just saying, we need, in this space, I find it really hard to find quantitative methods that are really respectful, ethical, and can really respond to our needs. So I'm just, asking you to help me. But I don't know. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you. Who else wants to respond to some of the other questions? Okay, Maheen, why don't you go ahead?
I'd just like to respond to this, to the comment about working with, let's say, the backlash actors, reaching out to the opposition. So while doing the research, we also did, for some of our case studies, interviews with opposition actors. And they were very happy to give us interviews, talk to us, and they were giving us ideas of how to, reach a consensus or come to some kind of understanding with the rights groups who were that they were in opposition with. So there was a willingness to talk and a willingness to find a way out of their, conflict. And for example, the issue of women's movement building bridges or being inclusive with sex workers. I'm part of a women's movement, Nari Bokho women's group, where we have a whole series of discussions between trade union leaders, women trade union leaders, and women sex worker representatives or associations. So it doesn't happen in one sitting. There's a whole process of trying to understand each other's realities and trying to understand the commonalities. And it takes time to build these solidarities. I'd just like to contribute that.
Thanks so much. Okay, Melanie, do you want to go next?
Thanks. Just brief reflections. I mean, they don't answer. These are big and troubling questions. And maybe just a reflection on the person who raised the issue of decolonization. I mean, I do think it's a term that risks becoming, what in academic parlance is an empty signifier. Like it just starts to mean nothing as everyone grabs onto it. And I also think it's very heavily contested. So it's being used to assert very right-wing positions. For example, the idea of homosexuality as un-African is actually put forward in the name of a decolonization, agenda by ruling African elites, or at least some of them. So it's being used both on the left and the right. And I think really the work is to be very clear about what is it we mean when we say decolonization and decolonial practice, and we have to build that and then assert it. So I just wanted to I wanted to bring that up. And then I think I think on the issue of trans-exclusionary politics writ large, I mean, I do think that there is certainly, and perhaps people are going to roll their eyes when I say this because folks might already be exhausted by this prospect, but I think that there is still a desperate need for safe and imaginative convenings around this conversation. But of course, those can only be on the basis of recognizing that there's some political and personal value in trying to build solidarities and push back against trans-exclusionary politics, wherever that's located. And I know in the report, it seems like IDS is almost inviting the prospect of doing some of that critical convening. And I think that would certainly be welcomed by me. Thanks, over.
Okay, Nana.
Okay, so I'm gonna address how to deal with anti-trans feminists. We are finishing a report on that. So, but the short answer is I don't know, but trying to develop on that. With this report, this is research that we have been doing for the last 2 years. We have talked with a lot of people from feminist movements, and one of the things that I like to highlight is that this division being explicit is not necessarily bad news, because we have seen that for many feminist movements, it's good that it's explicit because we know who can we align with. Because it is tricky, because for some agendas like abortion rights, we can have convergences, but at the same time, not really, because it's going to, for them, it has to be sex-based and not gender-based, or people with the ability to get pregnant. So although it seems that there is a possibility of a partnership, they are also aligning with far-right congressmen. And so how can you actually be partners with groups such as this? So I just want to highlight that this division is not necessarily bad, being so open, because we have noticed that for many feminists, it makes it easier for us to know where to draw the line, who we can work with.
Thank you so much. There's a lot of wisdom there. I know our time is up. Do we have time for some? Good. So we still have time for a couple of questions from the online audience.
Maybe just in the interest of time, we'll just take one question just to give a bit of time for a wrap up. So there's been a few, but I wanted to pick a question from Karen Carlson, who says the discussion has been very positive and empowering, focusing on what we can do to focus on solidarity and keep on participating. But to what extent do you think the backlash is silencing or makes us try to fight to stand our ground rather than advance gender equality? And is it more silencing for certain actors than for others?
So I don't think you all need to answer that. Just maybe one or two of you, if you've got something burning to say. Who would like to step in? Oh, Nana, go ahead. Have you got your hand up? No, that's from before. Okay.
Sorry, I forgot.
Yeah.
Maybe just a reflection, is not a response. But I think the space that scares me the most is the online space. We have a lot of evidence in Africa, I live in Ethiopia, of how many political and activists and journalists and human rights defenders are withdrawing from the online space because of the amount of harassment, harm, threats that they receive. So to me, that cuts across. And if you are a person with disability, if you are a person of color, if you are an LGBT, you're even more affected. So I think that is the space that scares me the most. And we still are really at the beginning of understanding how to protect and support people in that space. There are more and more initiatives that are there to people where survivor or people that have been attacked can go and ask for images and people to be denounced, but it's a breadcrumb. And one piece of work that we're quite proud of that we're doing with IDRC in Africa is to try to create many more data sets in local languages to try to detect harmful language in non-national languages, because at the moment this is not possible, to try to reduce a little bit the level of harm, but it's really complex and it's going to take time.
Thank you. Maheen.
Just to respond on the, if backlash is affecting some people more than others, I think the more vulnerable you are, let's say if you're from a minority religion, minority ethnic group, younger women and older women, if you are from a sexual diverse community, these all increase the vulnerability to backlash and being able to withstand the backlash, which is why solidarity with other groups is very important.
Thank you so much. And now I'll hand over to Sohaila to close.
Thank you, Susie, for conducting that and moderating that discussion. And thank you to all the panelists. You guys were brilliant and the questions were brilliant. My remit from the comms team, and I'm looking at Steve, is to offer some words of wisdom and then to shamelessly plague sort of cater idea stuff. So let's see how I do. And there are many things, and the discussion was very rich, but it was also quite useful in terms of reflecting on not just what is going on in the world, but also touching on what do we need, what are the challenges, and in some cases, stories of hope, right? A few things that we need to kind of, I guess, reflect on a bit further, and the report is on building solidarities. One is, of course, what is the alternate vision that we are offering? Because the other group is offering a vision that didn't exist in the past, and they're also talking about a future, right? But at the same time, we are holders of history of change that has happened. Some bits of it are here in terms of what happened at IDS, but all of us have participated in that history, and we have foremothers and forefathers who have participated in that. So we also have visions and sort of a history of how we want to talk about the past. So how do we do that? And what are we doing is important. It is also important to remember that the field of gender and development, because we are sitting at IDS, has always been fraught. It has always been fraught with many different tensions, partly because it draws from feminist theory, but it also draws from practical experiences in the field, but it is nested in development studies, which is deeply colonial. And in a sense, you can contest the deep neoliberal paradigms. And there have been depoliticization in this field in the way we lost certain concepts and certain things that had deeper meaning. For example, think about empowerment and how we understand empowerment and how empowerment is interpreted in many different ways. Similarly, we can see that how sex and gender are interpreted in so many different ways, but we also have the power to interpret and reclaim back or create new meanings, which is what's happening and which is what you have heard from Melanie, from Nana. But it's also about what sort of Ina talked about and Vivek talked about and comes across in the report is the fragmentation within us, the different tensions, the hierarchies, right? Hierarchies both in terms of what you do, whose decision counts, who represents, who voices, who has access to resources. But it's also about hierarchies in the way whose knowledge counts, right? In the way knowledge has been produced, what counts as evidence, as you heard from Benedetta. In these cases, what is important is, as you heard, when we talk about radical solidarity is not easy to build. It's hard to build because it creates lots of different types of discomforts that you'll have to deal with. It requires reflection, not just in the way you act, but in the how you engage. It requires those kind of convenings. It also requires for us to agree to disagree, but at the same time work together, because we are at a point where we don't have the luxury of not working together, right? We have to come together. It's not in a fluffy sense. Let's hold hands and sing Kumbaya. I'm not saying that. Please don't take that I'm making a flippant comment. It's about doing that hard work, thinking through what do you need to do in the short term. In the short term, as we are seeing, and you heard stories where Mahin was talking about that people push back, and there are many stories of resistance here. But it's also about the long term, and it is going to be a long, hard fight. It's not going to be easy. So that's my word of wisdom. Now I'm going to shamelessly talk about a bit of two IDS events that are coming up. One is on Monday, on the 25th. It's from the Countering Backlash program. This is where our partners are talking about what has worked in their context to fight back against gender-based violence. It's very important to learn about strategies and learn about strategies of, in this context, this works, right? Because that's the kind of knowledge that we need. So Monday, 25th at 12:30, please do join us. The second one is the Sustaining Power exhibition. So you heard about the visual strategies and how do you talk about stories. So these are photos and audio visuals of the 16 movements that we worked with in South Asia. There is an exhibit in IDS, but the exhibit is also traveling in South Asia. So we are very excited, but it will also be available online. So please do check us out. Apart from that, at IDS, of course, we are passionate about how we think about gender and development, how we produce knowledge, and how we create future leaders. So I am looking forward to this report in a way generating more discussions and more conversations and convenings that we need, and leading to collaborative work. Lastly, I would like to thank all our panelists. They have been wonderful, and our participants, both on and offline, who have asked very, very stimulating questions and hard questions, and our comms team for organizing this event. Thank you all so much.